Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you're following us from. Welcome to the fifth of the Reflections on the Future of Europe, organized by New Europeans. My name is Jelena Jankic, and I'm part-time professor at the Global Governance Program of the EUI's Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies. I'm also co-director of the Global Citizenship Observatory, GlobalCit. I will moderate tonight's session, where Agnieszka Weinar asks, does EU citizenship count for anything outside the European Union? Our speaker, Agnieszka Weinar, is adjunct research professor at Carleton University and coordinator of New Europeans in North America. She also serves as executive director of Canada-Europe Women in Business. Between 2018 and 2020, she was the chair of the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Alumni Association in North America. Agnieszka's research has focused on the North-North mobility, and most recently, particularly, she has engaged in researching issues facing internationally mobile European citizens. Her panel will be composed of and discussed by four fantastic commentators that we have with us tonight. First, Roxana Barbulescu, who's Associate Professor of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Leeds. Second, Ruvi Ziegler, Associate Professor of International Refugee Law at the University of Reading. Then Dimitris Ballas, Professor of Economic Geography at the University of Groningen. And finally, Sarah Genti, a JSD candidate at the Yale Law School and a visiting lecturer at the Free University in Brussels and the University Saint Louis in Brussels. So just to introduce you to how we'll go on this evening, first, Agnieszka will speak for about 25 minutes, and we will follow up with a panel discussion of about 30 minutes. After the discussion amongst the panelists, we will invite Roger Casali from the New Europeans to open the floor to questions from our Facebook audience. So without any further ado, I pass the floor to Agnieszka. Please.
Thank you, Jelena, for this kind introduction, and thank you for all the panelists that you are with me here. What I'm presenting today is loosely based on my Marie Curie research that I conducted in Canada and the EU between 2015 and 2017. I have a shameless plug for my book on the cover, so please look at it. For the last 5 years, I have been actually engaged in a number of pan-European networks in North America, and my interest in these issues developed from purely academic to more, let's say, life engaged. When I discovered a whole new world, which I wanted to share with you tonight as well. So let's start. What I will be talking about today is three things. First, I will briefly discuss the limitations of European citizenship outside of the EU and share with you my views on why it is a problem. Then I would try to answer the question why we should actually care about EU citizens outside of the EU. And in the end, I will propose some way forward that is more practical than idealistic, I would say. So before I start, I wanted to share with you the constituting elements of the European citizenship, the way it is discussed in the treaties, we see that in all its activities, the Union shall observe the principle of equality of its citizens, who shall receive equal attention from its institutions, bodies, offices, and agencies. So what is important? The citizens are equal. Every national of a member state shall be a citizen of the Union, which is very important also for the diaspora. And citizenship of the Union shall be additional to and not replace national citizenship. So we see that there is no, let's say, opposition between belonging to a member state or Europe. Then what I also find important when I think about citizenship is the definition of the European Parliament, where they say that EU citizenship refers to a relationship between the citizen and the European Union, which is defined by rights, duties, and political participation. And I want to enter here in the discussion because I think that the legal analysis has been done very well by my co-panelist Ruvi a month ago, and you can watch his presentation on New European TV on YouTube. I will go with a more political approach to the issue. So what are the limitations and why it is a problem? Usually when we think about the citizenship or membership in the community, we can actually use a theoretical approach, many theoretical approaches. I will throw at you one idea on how we can conceptualize it. So we can think about citizenship as thick and thin membership, where thick membership is are all political, economic, and social ties with the entity that actually gives out the membership. So it can be a country, but it can be also a region. I'm thinking here about Quebec, for example, right? It's a different thing to be a Quebecer than a Canadian. The same can be in Belgium, but we can also think about the European level in this sense. Then thin membership is everything that is more symbolic, and it's more about ideas and identity and identification. So when we look at the EU citizenship within the European Union, we sort of tend to agree on the level of academic analysis that we take the thick national identification, we add to that a thin level of the EU identification, a layer of thick membership as defined in the treaties. And then we work a little bit on the belonging, EU identity through the pan-European spheres, pan-European public spheres. And in the end, we will end up with the EU citizenship that will have these two elements. And this works to a point when you are on the territory of the European Union. And I will explain why it does not work outside. So let's start with thick membership on the EU level. What do we have? We have the right to vote. So as we know, each EU national should have the right to vote in the European elections and to present themselves in these elections. However, electoral rights are not equal because they depend on the member states and their own regulations. So it is not possible for all, it's not accessible for all to vote. So when you think about being outside of the European Union, it's even more complicated because the rights to vote when you are outside are even more restricted. Another issue is the right to present yourself to these elections. You cannot do this if you have not resided in the European Union for minimum of 5 years. And there is no outside district outside of the European Union where you could present yourself to these elections. So of course, this right is not really working for us. Then we have the rights to petition the parliament. We have the rights to write to the European Ombudsman. And then we have the right to come up with the European Citizens Initiative. And it all looks well. However, when you look exactly at the constituting regulations for those rights, they are limited to the EU nationals who reside on the EU territory. Of course, you can support them. So you can support a petition, but you cannot really get engaged with the EU institutions as a political entity when you are outside of the European Union. Then, okay, we can say that we have the consular protection, but it only works in the countries where your home country has no embassy. So, for example, it's absolutely useless in Canada and in the US. You cannot use that. Right, and then we have, of course, the Grail, we have the intra-EU mobility. However, the key here is intra-EU, so you need to be again on the territory of the European Union to be able to use it. And I wanted only to add that, for example, right now in the situation of the lockdown, me as a Polish citizen, I cannot go now to France because of the lockdowns. I have to go to Poland because as a citizen of Poland, I have the right to go back to Poland, but I don't have the right to go to France from Canada, right? This is what I'm talking about. So in this sense, my European mobility does not exist. So, well, this is my answer. Nothing really works the way it should. How about the thin membership? So all these activities that are supposed to help you become more European. On the territory of the European Union, you have the Europe for Citizens program, which supports all the initiatives raising awareness about European Union, the rights of the EU citizens. Then you can engage in citizen dialogues. And of course, you can also support the institutions by participating in the dialogues and consultations. However, the first two, so Europe for Citizens program and the dialogues, are limited to, again, EU nationals who reside within the territory of the European Union, but doesn't work. Which of course is problematic, because when you live outside and you would like to engage with the European Union and to raise awareness about European Union outside, you cannot do it because you do not have access to this instrument. So my proposition here is that we are facing really one big limitation on the citizenship, which is the territorial limitation. And what it means, it basically means that because EU citizenship is a transnational one, which means that a group of states basically decided that this is a legally binding concept within their territory. and it only works there. So outside of the European Union, it carries no weight. But what is interesting, there is no territorial limitation in the treaties. At least I have not seen it, right? So now the usual question for the rights is, do we carry the rights with us wherever we go or not as citizens? And let's be clear, I do not argue here for international recognition of the EU citizenship worldwide. However, I argue for equal treatment and equal access to these rights, regardless of your residency. So how does it work in practice? And I used here the infographics from EUI. Jelena will probably recognize those. These are for the voting rights quite a while ago. They were created around 2014, as far as I remember. So on the left, you see all the countries that allow for voting outside of their territory in the European elections, for example. And so they are all green. Yellow will only allow for voting within European territory, and the red will not allow at all. On the right, you see the reality. So basically, yes, you can vote, but you, for example, have to register, and the registration might be different, the requirements might be difficult, especially for people who are mobile. And let's be clear, European citizens are among the most mobile people internationally, not only within the European Union. And they keep moving. So very often they do not register, they don't have time, or they forget about it. So we don't have an equal access for everybody. Me as a Polish person, I think that my registration is very simple. I register basically up to 3 days before the elections, and it's all fine. Whereas the French have to register at once in their lifetime, but they have to remember about that. But this is one issue, but there are also other issues that are very recent. We are talking here about the data protection, for example, climate change. There were new court rulings that actually support the rights of EU citizens to those 2 issues, right? So we have the right to data protection, and we have the right to a good climate. Now, how will be the future of this territorially limited citizenship in the face of the unterritorial internet, for example? Who cares about my rights to privacy when I live in Canada? Am I protected? And this is a question to the lawyers on the panel, I think. So now, why should we care? And this is where I propose to look at the new reality that we have on our hands. So first of all, in our age, territory is not as important as people. So all the countries in the world recognize the importance of the human capital. And this is why a growing number of countries actually develop the diaspora engagement policies. And I don't like the word diaspora because it sounds a little bit old, but actually it's not. What is interesting is that right now we're looking at immigrants and the diasporas as the assets. So the diasporas are ambassadors promoting economic and political interests of their countries of origin, which I also don't like as a word, but let's say the countries they feel connection to abroad. And let's look at that. So we have a political context in which basically European Union is squeezed. It has been recognized because of Trump era, actually, that European Union has to engage more with the middle powers, where we do have quite a big European diaspora, and where our links are pretty strong because of the people-to-people contacts that we have and the mobility of the Europeans, like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, but also other places in the world. US will probably not change, as we know, that much. And then on the other hand, we have the trade context with the European Union that is building bridges to new countries, proposing trade agreements. And this is very important because EU, the diaspora, actually supports this trade relations with the partner countries. So when we look, for example, at the EU-Canada trade agreement and who is using it, of course, we have the big players, but we also have SMEs and SMEs that are the diaspora driven. The only problem with this is that it's limited. So, for example, again, Romanian or Polish Canadian would use this instrument to have economic relations with Europe, but by Europe they mean Poland or Romania, right? They don't really think that they might do business with Lithuania. And it's not because they don't want to, it's just because they don't know. They don't know internal market well. They don't know anything about European Union. They know only their country of origin from which they probably emigrated quite a while ago. So I believe that the diaspora members, if they are made aware of the European Union, they could be ambassadors not only for trade and internal market, but also for such key policies like Green Deal or digital policy. And finally, they could react to misrepresentations of EU in the local media. This is why I put there also the information about the vaccines, because the level of understanding what is happening with the European Union and the vaccines, for example, in Canada is dismissal. My other proposition is that we should probably work towards more engagement with the Europeans abroad. Now we have some misconceptions there. So we say that usually that the diaspora is a historical diaspora, but it's not true. There are two groups. So there are people who are settled, who emigrated sort of long ago, and there are all new people who are more mobile and more European because they have the European experience. We always say that there is no attachment towards the EU, outside of the EU, not to mention inside, but let's focus on the outside now. However, in my research, in my survey that I did with the Europeans abroad, around 15% voted in the European elections in 2014. This is very high for the fact that they have like no exposure. There is no one telling them, hey, go to vote. And then do they really care? So I did this survey, and they answered this question. Do you feel you are a citizen of the European Union? And what was interesting, majority of no's were the older people who did not really have the experience of, for example, European mobility or their kids, whereas the younger people, more recent immigrants, especially if they had the experience of the mobility within the European Union, they were more attached to Europe, obviously. So my other observation here is why I think that there is something going on abroad and why we could actually engaged with success is that there have been changes. And I have to be blunt, I think that this is mainly because of the UK leaving EU, and the fact that UK is basically right now like Canada, so everybody got interested what is happening with all these EU but nationals, you know, outside of the European Union. So, for example, we have an organization like Europeans Throughout the World, which is an umbrella organization for the national diaspora organizations, and it works very well. But on the other hand, we have organizations like New Europeans who are reaching out outside of the EU, and they are not nationally based, right? We are all here and we come from different countries. And this is not mutually exclusive, but there is this urge to have something more than only national identification when you leave Europe. Then another example is the Marie Curie Alumni Association that has been created by the Commission to support the researchers within the European Union. But what happened with time, actually, the researchers themselves started creating the chapters outside of the European Union. And this is important. They did this themselves. They wanted this pan-European link for a number of reasons. Basically, because when you are mobile and you experience the EU mobility, you really will want to continue. And then there is this othering issue, where, but basically the moment you leave Europe, you start feeling European, because, and you look for other Europeans in terms of culture or mentality. And on this picture, I have my Marie Curie Alumni Association team from North American chapter. They're all coming from different European countries. They all have their links with the diaspora, the national diaspora, but they are also engaged on the European level. What we also do in these networks, we of course promote European policies, like European research area in the case of the Marie Curie Alumni Association, or European trade policies in other networks. So what can we do? And this is where I will be finishing. So what I propose really is to focus on two areas. One is thick membership, and there I think that we can only work on voting to the Parliament, the European Parliament. So we have option one, we all go e-voting without the limitation, but of course we have some issue there. Several countries like Ireland or Latvia would have a problem of possible disproportionate impact of diaspora living outside of the EU on these elections, thinking about UK, for example. So there might be issues with the member states who might not agree to that. Then we can have the extraterritorial voting districts like the French or Portuguese model, where you divide the world into the districts, and then there is a possibility of having actually representatives from these districts, which could solve two issues: the issue of voting and the issue of spending, or presenting yourself in the elections. And this would be very good for settled the diasporas who stay in place and know their representatives and their issues. What is interesting, these people in France and Portugal, they don't really engage in the domestic issues. They work on international issues, like they're like advisors really to different committees. And option number three, the transnational lists. where some seats could be dedicated to non-EU resident MPs. And we could actually by choosing from transnational lists or voting for a political group, we could omit the issues with the member states because this is transnational. So, and last, as regards the thin membership, where we need awareness raising and networking far more than we do it now, I think that the easiest would be just to open the right to petition, the right to initiative to people from the outside of the EU. It's not too complicated. And then the awareness raising, so inclusion of EU citizens living in the diaspora in the Europe for Citizens program. And I say this because, as we all know, there is quite a number of member states who give out the citizenship to the second and third generation of immigrants, right? And these kids, for example, in Canada, right, they don't really know anything about European Union. They have a passport, but they don't understand what it is. They think that they have a Polish passport, but they still, for example, do not use it to go to Poland to study or to work, but they use it to go to the UK. I mean, used to use it to go to the UK to study and work. Right now, because UK is no longer a part of the EU, this is why we need to probably take a look and get them back, because otherwise they won't go to the EU anymore at all, maybe. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka, for this fascinating talk and fascinating presentation. And I think we've all learned a lot from it, and I think it's given us quite a lot of food for thought. Now, right before opening the discussion to the panel, I just wanted to use my prerogative as the moderator and perhaps ask you just a follow-up question on your concluding remarks. As you know, that I've been working on extraterritorial citizenship for different kinds of, let's say, new EU citizens. When you speak about initiatives regarding voting rights, obviously, would any policy proposals be acceptable across the member states and European institutions if and when and how, in practice, would these proposals differentiate between the voting rights of mobile EU citizens who've exercised their prerogative to move within the EU, as opposed to EU citizens who are in third countries? And I think that when it comes to third countries, the concept of EU diaspora in a way comes into play, because as you rightly point out, there are EU citizens who've exercised, let's say, their, well, in a way, well, not mobility rights under the EU treaties, but they have relocated to a third country, as opposed to, let's say, citizens who get their second passport through ancestry. So what, in a way, would be an acceptable policy proposal to regulate EU citizenship rights of, let's say, EU citizens? Should all EU citizens have equal access? So this is a normative and the policy question, and you know that there's quite a lot of political contention around it in general. So if you could reflect on this in a minute or two, and then we'll open the floor to further questions.
Thank you, Jelena. This is actually, yeah, this is complicated. So for me, the easiest way around it is, of course, when we think about the people who relocate temporarily. I think that this is the easiest way, the easiest group to sort of work on, because obviously they are EU citizens and they should not be penalized only because they go for a period of time abroad, right? So the solution there should be not very politically, loaded. And there we could think about the transnational lists or voting or some other instruments that could help. However, the diaspora question, in the sense of the diasporas that are more, let's say, permanent outside of the EU, I think that this is a very important political issue also for the member states, because when you remember the map, you have some member states that allow this and some that don't. In the end, the member states themselves are not equal then, right? So they don't have similar weight. Because if you take, I'm sorry, I'm Polish, so I will have that example. We can vote. And of course, outside of the EU, especially in North America, majority of the Polish old diaspora would vote for the Eurosceptic parties, also because they don't really know anything about European Union. And this has an impact on how the European Parliament looks then, right? So this should be really discussed and thought about quite carefully. Is it really what the member states want? Do they want this disparity, or they all want to give the diasporas equal voice? Or maybe not, but we should have it like equal in a way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka. Now I'll hand over to Roxana for any questions or comments on Agnieszka's presentation.
Yes, thank you very good thank you very much, Agnieszka, for the presentation, and very interesting. I was making many notes, and just it's very useful and very interesting to hear you walk through these possibilities and suggesting interventions that are fitting for the times we live in. And there were quite a few points that I didn't think, and it was really nice to hear you address them, particularly how it plays out in the context of the pandemic and the right to re-enter and move in such times of crisis. I had a few questions, and I was very excited about the possibility of having a transnational constituency. Because this will bring further the transnational project that we so much hear, but it's very difficult to realize. I think that this is a valuable contribution to transnational studies. I have a question whether it is the transnational rights would be a question of more is more, or whether it would inactivate some of the rights. Sometimes it happens that some rights become dormant if you exercise some rights. So is it a question, how would they interact? How would they sit together? Sometimes you do see that with dual nationality. In your opinion, would there be a case of similar things? And some of the points that you're making were resonating strongly with what I believe was a policy suggestion at some point for Hillary Clinton and her campaign with smart diaspora, and reactivate those links with diasporas across the country. So I really like this kind of utilitarian perspective on enhancing and enfranchising European citizens and establishing equality of rights would have this other benefit of bringing forward a foreign policy agenda and engaging more with the world. But I also had a question finally about geography to some extent. Obviously, Europeans tend to be located first in countries with higher income, and in what we call settler countries, isn't it? So there is a clear history there and heritage, many generations. So certainly Canada, Australia, United States would be especially well positioned in this new world map if it were to be enfranchised, and Jelena would redo the map. So how would that contribute in a way to Europe, to make Europe more known and more to extend the interest and the outreach of Europe around the world? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roxana. I think you've given Agnieszka quite a lot of questions and things to think about. So I'll hand over to her for a brief reflection.
Very quickly. So on the first point on how giving the rights, if I understood you correctly, would it really have an impact on more engagement? We don't know. The truth is that people get engaged on the topics that they know. So for me, it's really less about giving the access to voting rights, but more about the work around awareness and building this relationship, you know, with, you cannot vote for the EU if you don't understand what it is. As we know from the European Union, right? There are people who don't vote. Not everybody votes because they don't understand what the EU is about. And even less here. So there is work to be done, and then we will see what happens. I still am quite optimistic about the mobile EU nationals who stay longer because they are mobile. They won't live in one place for, you know, well, 20 years probably. They will be going back and forth, and in this way they can support this project if they feel supported. That this is important, you know. This is what any diaspora expert will tell you, that a diaspora needs to be cherished in order to really care. Then you have the issue of geography, as you said. I think that we are a little bit obsessed with the sort of white Europeans. We tend to forget that there is quite a big European diaspora of the returnees in Morocco, for example, or, you know, places around in the neighboring countries of the European Union, but also further afield. When we had UK still in the EU, I had this graph where I showed that actually among the people who emigrate to Canada from Europe, the top language is English, French, and Punjabi, and then Arabic, and they were all Europeans, right? So there is a possibility, but it's terrible that we look at these people only as the Moroccan diaspora, for example, even if they are maybe second generation or third, right? They are not. They are Europeans, and they should be actually recognized as such. So yeah, this is my answer.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka. And now I hand over to Ruby Ziegler for his feedback on your talk.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Jelena, and thanks, Agnieszka, for this sort of, as you say, political exposition of what it means to physically leave the European Union and how thin that kind of connection that keeps you attached. And so I've got several points that some of which are legal and some perhaps more conceptual. So the first is on, I think, what you've pointed out quite rightly, that there is divergence in the practices of member states themselves when it comes to their own citizens living abroad in their own national elections as to whether they're allowed to participate in those elections from abroad or not. And if they are, by which modality? Is it through transnational lists? Sorry, through special designated seats on in Parliament for overseas electors, or through the general modality. Now, I think politically, I think that is the biggest obstacle to having participation across all EU member states for citizens who live outside the EU, because member states take the view that because they themselves don't believe that when their citizens are abroad, they should continue to be able to participate. They don't think that should extend in respect of the EU citizenship component. Now, I, as you know, a month ago made the case very strongly that I believe there should be streamlining and harmonization on EU level. I think political equality Article 9 demands that. And I think we shouldn't go for a lowest common denominator, but for the highest common denominator on this. So my view would be that would require those countries that currently don't allow their own citizens to vote from abroad. They may wish to keep it for national elections if they believe strongly in that policy, but they can't keep it for EU elections, precisely for the reasons. I mean, you highlighted one reason, which is the unequal effect that it has on Parliament because of the voting patterns, but it fundamentally means that different citizens outside the EU are unequal in the way they're treated by the EU fundamentally, and their rights to vote with our institutions. So that's one big point that I think links those two elements that you talked about, the sort of solutions that you propose, which I'm very amenable to, and the fact that there is divergence of practices. I think both of them politically are the genuine stumbling block. But the second kind of strand of questions, which I'll be interested in your thoughts on, actually speaks to, I think I would put it as the intersection between the EU legal order as attempting to create something that is supranational, that goes beyond the nation state, when it comes directly into clash with traditional public international law. And what I mean by this is that what you have described is, imagine somebody's outside the EU and they need protection. They can only rely on another EU member state if their own country isn't represented, but their country is in most cases represented. And so if their country is rubbish in the way they represent them, or indeed if their country doesn't protect EU-related rights that they have, they can't go to the EU mission in that country and ask for the EU mission to represent them, right? And the reason for this is that the EU is in this schizophrenic, bizarre position. It has missions. I mean, there was this row in the UK recently about whether they should be allowed to kind of have a proper mission. But there is an EU mission, but it actually doesn't operate in the same way that a nation state's mission operates in a country. And I think that goes to the heart of, I think, what you described very well as the thin and thick citizenship. Part of the premise, I also wrote about this in my book, right? Part of the premise of having citizenship is the notion that you carry part of it with you when you're abroad, and you can rely on your state to support you in your hour of need. And the reality is, for EU citizens, they can rely on a state, but it's on their own member state. They can't rely on the EU as a state, right? So I think that calls for wider, analysis and thinking from our perspective on how do we change that politically, make this perhaps a possibility, and I think a lot will then follow from that.
Thank you so much, Rui. I think the political aspect is very important. Agnieszka, what would you say to that?
I mean, I can only agree. However, I just want to maybe flag one element that is a little bit, I think that we don't think about very often. The EU, the delegations outside of the European Union have the prerogative on trade. This is clear, right? Because this is EU prerogative. So every time we talk about trade, this is led by the delegation, and they are the ones who raise awareness about the trade-related issues, and that this is where I think that there is an opening where we could start because we could envisage specific the diaspora engagement on trade, and I don't think that any member state would not like that. You know, member states like trade, that the more the merrier, and if we would encourage them, you know, with this idea that through the EU delegations, through the EU programs, we can actually open up to a transnational diaspora investments, that would be great. But the core problem of the political engagement with the European Union, it won't be solved for a long time. So this is why we should work on what we can work. That's it.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka. Dimitris, would you like to offer Agnieszka some feedback?
Yes, thank you very much, Helena, and thank you, Agnieszka, for a fantastic talk, really fascinating and thought-provoking. I have three points that the first one relates to some extent to what Roxana said about a transnational constituency. So from a practical perspective, I think it may be relevant to note that I think it is a law voted this year that gives Greeks who are the Greek diaspora the right to vote abroad, and there will be 3 MPs out of the 300 of the Greek parliament who will be for the Greeks abroad. Greek citizens abroad would vote for them, and as far as I understand it, you can also stand for the Greek parliament and being abroad. So I think from your fascinating talk, I think I could see an extension of that. So we could have the European Parliament and a number of MEPs who are not allocated to a member state, but are allocated to European diaspora outside the EU. So that would be a nice way to deal with a lot of the things you mentioned from a practical perspective, and also strengthen the identity and get the message there that they matter. The second point I have is relating to what you said about identity, belonging. I think it's interesting, and I think I say that from my own personal experience. I think when I am outside the EU, in North America, for example, with other Europeans, it's quite often this reminds us of how much we have in common as Europeans. It strengthens our common values, and you do mention the new Europeans are there to support that and the common values and what we have as shared values. And I think a key one, a key value in relation to Europe and let's say North America, is the abolition of the death penalty, for example. So that's something that the EU it's part of its mission. It spends money to abolish the death penalty outside the EU, not just we have it, take it for a given. This is unacceptable to have the death penalty in Europe. It's a shared value, and I think that's important to remind ourselves. We know, I think when we go abroad, we remember that this is a key value that we have, and it might be good to remind Europeans from the diaspora that you mentioned who don't know what this is about. This is one of our key values, and something to celebrate and be an ambassador of that value and other values. But I think that's a really flagship one. So I think that works as a marker for belonging, but also as ambassadors. And my third point links to that in perhaps, and also the European Parliament idea. We could have a European embassy. I think it's time to have that. We need a European embassy that deals with all the practicalities, but also is there to support and promote Europe as an idea, our values, including the abolition of the death penalty, for example. And in relation to that, tomorrow is marks the 20th of March, marks the anniversary of the Greek independence, 200 years. So it's 200 years, and it's celebrated across Greece, but also around the world. So for example, tomorrow, a good example is the Sydney Opera House will be highlighted. There will be a projection of the Greek flag tomorrow in Sydney. And there are other examples like that around the world to celebrate Greek independence. And I wonder, we could have the same thing for Europe. So have a European embassy and key values. When was it when we abolished the death penalty? Remind everyone that, and have events like that, the Treaty of Rome, key dates that further bolster and have the diaspora of Europe to also take part in that, in the same way that the Greeks take part in the celebration of Independence Day, Irish Americans take part in St. Patrick's Day. We have a European equivalent of that. Can think of many examples that shared values and use this to celebrate these values and European and Europe. So thanks. That's sorry, I went too long of a statement, but hopefully you can.
Thank you so much, Dimitris. I hand over to Agnieszka.
Very quickly, it's just to say that the shared values are actually at the core of my concern, I would say. That this is why I am so vocal on opening the thin membership instruments that we have operating within the European Union, also outside, to raise awareness. I think that the core would be actually to enter the diaspora schools. We have plenty of those, right? We have plenty of the diaspora schools around the world with one course of citizenship and the values to explain what it is. And then probably the kids will actually discover that the European values are very close, for example, to Canadian values, but they don't know this. In many countries, in many places, they are taught only the traditional courses from like 20 years ago from their home countries without the EU on the curricula at all. And then they come up with a passport and they don't understand what it means to be European, really. They think that this is about eating mozzarella. But you see, there is a problem there that we have to really discuss and maybe change. And by the way, we do the European month in May, so we do that, but it's not very well known among the diaspora, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka. And last but not the least, Sarah Genti.
Thank you so much, Jelena. Thank you, Agnieszka, for the talk, and thank you for all the others for the interesting conversation. I would have one first question and maybe two small comments. I would like to maybe come back to the title of the presentation, EU Citizenship and Identity Outside of the EU. And you kind of refer a lot to this question of awareness, identity, etc. But my question would be, would you say that citizenship is about identity? Because at least as a lawyer, I would mainly say that citizenship is about status, it's about rights, but it's not about identity. And so how would you define identity? And by actually raising this question of being aware of awareness or identity, to me, we are kind of reproducing the nation states kind of discourse here. And so to me, it's a kind of a slippery kind of slope. And what does it mean to be European? Like when you see that within Europe, we have a hard time to agree on what do we mean by the rule of law and what are EU values, and that they are interpreted in very different ways depending on the country. I think that for me, it's a thought-provoking question, but this is something I think we really need to think about. Like citizenship is firstly about status and rights, and then we need to speak about rights and the right to vote. But then to me, the question of awareness is something else, which is a part. And so this was my main question. But maybe a second kind of remark or question is, you spoke a lot about the right to petition and the right to ombudsman. But these rights are actually also accessible to legal residents in the EU. So they are not the prerogative of EU citizens. And so how do you deal with this question, like saying that the citizenship abroad cannot have access to this right, but at the same time we allow residents and legal residents to basically have access to these rights. And so it's not only a prerogative of EU citizens. So I would like you to maybe to address that question. And a third one is, mainly about competencies. Like, it's interesting because you said, yeah, maybe it's a question for the lawyers when you came with the question of climate change and the right to have a good climate. But if we come back to the Charter of Fundamental Rights, for instance, Article 37, which is the right to environmental protection, this article, like, of course, is in the Charter, but then we have further, like, an article saying that basically the Charter doesn't extend the field of application of the EU. So there is this fundamental rights, of course, but the EU is very limited in its scope of competence. So as EU citizens abroad, you can claim things, but there are, of course, all the territorial and material, like, limitations of competences. So this is basically what I would like you to comment, if it's possible, because I find this question all very interesting as for your presentation and to discuss that too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. I think these are really difficult questions, Agnieszka.
Yeah, and we have not much time. So I will just say very briefly, of course, I'm not a lawyer. So of course, for me, citizenship is much more than the legal link. We can think about the citizenship in the political sense, in the engaged sense, right? And when we talk about the voting rights that are very legal, you cannot have them if you don't have awareness about what you're voting for. It doesn't make any sense, really. So there are always these two elements. In the political sense, citizenship is about engagement, right? So you have rights, but you have to use them in order to actually activate the citizenship. Otherwise, it doesn't work, because you don't vote and you are not engaged in any other way, right? And of course, thank you for bringing it up, that people who reside within the EU and are not EU nationals have more rights than we do outside. This is very interesting. But this is problematic for me, because, as I say, the mobility outside of the EU is actually penalized because of that. And there are territorial limitations, but when we think about the data, for example, the privacy law, if I say that if I put on my computer a program that will tell the internet that my IP is located, for example, in Germany, suddenly I have the right to be forgotten by Google. If I don't do that, I don't have this right. And I'm still the same person staying in Ottawa. And because my right to my data and my privacy is limited by my IP. So this is an interesting issue to discuss by lawyers, but and not only, I hope, but a very important one when we think about, especially after the pandemic, about the number of EU nationals who are active online with the different IPs.
Speaking about the online communities, Roger Casali from New Europeans has been following us on Facebook. So Roger, I'd like to invite you to perhaps read a couple of questions that we have received from our Facebook viewers. And if you're watching us on Facebook, if you haven't asked your question, perhaps try and do so while Roger is speaking, so he might actually add yours to the list of questions he has for Agnieszka. Roger, please.
Thank you very much, Elena. And there has been a great deal of activity, a lot of people watching us on Facebook. So thank you to them and following the debate and sending us questions also by email. And we have one question from Michel, who's based in the south of France. He asks, it's about awareness actually. Michel from the south of France, he asks, do European citizens who move out of the European Union, do they become more or less aware of their EU citizenship as time goes on. We have a question from Lena, who is based in Munich, and she has picked up the point about that Agnieszka made about people who lose their EU citizenship rights, such as the population of the United Kingdom. And she asks, are EU citizens treated better in Canada than they are in the UK? And how are they treated in the USA? And then we have a third question from Virginia, who's based in central Italy. She wonders what the impact of the global pandemic will be on the value of EU citizenship. There's talk about a digital vaccine certificate that might go with some sort of green card that was proof of your identity as an EU citizenship. Would that be something that would be helpful to have in your bag when you were waiting in the queue to get into Canada or the United States? So perhaps I'll just leave it at those three questions, but I've got several more, Yelena, but back to you.
Thank you so much, Roger. So let's hand it over to Agnieszka for the first round of replies.
I will be quick. Awareness, basically, I would say out of heart, out of sight. The longer you stay outside of the EU, the less you care about it. And this is why the constant engagement is so important, not to lose these people. This is what I wanted to say. For the question number one, then as regards the treatment, there are no EU nationals in Canada. So that's it. There used to be EU nationals in the UK, and the concept is understood. Outside of that, in Canada, US, Japan, China, this does not exist. I cannot come to the Canadian border and tell them that I have the European passport. I am Polish. Then for as regards to the pandemic, this is really interesting because, and I look at it from the point of view again of the mobility issues. So if indeed the vaccine passport is required, for example, in the EU, for all EU nationals, what will happen with those who live in the US and want to go for holidays? I don't know, to Greece or to Spain, but they are not Greek nor Spanish. Where will they get these passports when they are not inside of the EU, right? So what will happen to me if I want to go to Greece and not to Poland, get my passport and then to Greece, right? So this is a very practical issue to be solved, but I hope it will be solved because we can get the passports for the dogs outside of the EU. So maybe for the people as well.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka. Before I hand over to Roger again, I think Ruby had a quick point to make.
Thanks, Gina. Yeah, just on that last point about vaccine passport, I mean, my understanding of the EU Commission's proposal is that when EU citizens and members of their family are vaccinated in a third country, as long as that third country is operating a vaccine that is a vaccine that the EMA is approved, as authorized for use in the EU, then there will actually be a requirement on the relevant EU member states to issue them a vaccination certificate or passport. And that will become very, very relevant for people in the UK, I think, but obviously for you and others elsewhere. So actually, I find this a really interesting example of a way in which, perhaps counter to many of the examples you were speaking about, there may be actually here a tangible benefit to being an EU citizen if you live outside the EU, because the Commission, at least perhaps in a streak of rare affinity to EU citizens abroad, has recognized there's a need to protect them as well.
Agnieszka, what would you say to Ruby's comment?
I think that this is all happening thanks to Brexit. I think that actually Brexit put us on the map. This is great. This is the window of opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much. So now I will hand over to Roger again for the last round of questions, and we will end with Agnieszka's responses to the Facebook questions that have arrived in the second round. Thank you.
Well, Agnieszka's mentioned the B word now. We've managed to go for 70 minutes without mention of the B word, but I was pretty sure it was going to come up at one point. And it allows me to say quite a few comments, Jelena, have been about people who have lost their European citizenship, who had it before and now have lost it. And they just picked up this point that Agnieszka made about how members of diaspora communities, grandchildren, for example, of Polish people living in the United States who perhaps don't speak Polish themselves or have never been to Poland, don't intend to go there, could get a European passport, could be Europeans with an EU passport, EU citizens, whereas millions of British people who probably identify themselves as Europeans will know how many have written that they're European on the census. When the census that was held last weekend is published, people were asked to identify themselves as Europeans. They can't dream of being Europeans unless, of course, I suppose they become Polish or Irish or something like that. And people are commenting on that. And we've actually had one comment from Naila Balok, who is from Pakistan, who was actually asking, she asked a very specific question to Agnieszka, which is there a kind of cutoff point for when grandchildren or great-grandchildren and so on can acquire EU citizenship? Back to you, Jelena.
Thank you so much, Roger. And I think I will leave the questions to Agnieszka, and then we will wrap the session up.
Jelena, that last question was probably for you more than for me. So you are, of course, welcome to answer because you are more versed in that. I just want to say that in the Polish case, which I know the most, of course, there is no cutoff date, but it happens sort of organically. So it just happens. But if you really wanted to keep renewing the citizenship of your kids, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, you can still do it because this will be the kids of the kids. But people don't do it. And this is what I wanted to say. I actually found that those who emigrated from Europe before being mobile, they don't see their passport as important. So I met, for example, a lot of Romanian or Bulgarian citizens who did not have their passports because their parents thought they are useless. Whereas, of course, those who experience the mobility would say, no, we are keeping it. We are going to the embassy to make sure that our kids also have it because this is useful, this is European. So the perception is really interesting there. Now, to the UK people, I mean, what can I tell you? I mean, you're not the only ones. I'm Polish, so of course I'm in the privileged position, but you know, the Danish or Dutch have the same issues as you do when they leave European Union. It's not very easy to keep the passport. Thank you.
Just before we wrap up, I do know why you said that it was my question, but I assure everyone we will have plenty of time to discuss the modes of acquisition and loss of citizenship in the European Union in the session in May, when I will speak about the different ways of obtaining, well, different member states' citizenship and thus EU citizenship by means of birth and the various forms of naturalization. So let's keep that for a different session. And to finish this one off, I'd like to again use my prerogative as the moderator and ask you about the Conference on the Future of Europe. Was there a citizens' assembly for the EU diaspora? And what should this assembly be about? What could they and should they ask for? So that would be, in a way, my concluding question to Agnieszka.
That would be a dream, right? But I don't think that really happens because, first of all, Europeans outside of the EU are not organized. So you are again organized by the diaspora groups, but they are diasporic groups. So it's a different approach, I would say. Whereas I think honestly that what we need is, my favorite model is actually the French model, and I think that EU models a lot of its institutions on the French ones. So that would be probably easy to apply. Is that they have their assembly, right? That is for the French outside of France, but they also have this way of knowing the diaspora through dedicated institutions that does research on them, but also builds the links with the French abroad. And such group for the Europeans would really have an important voice in the conference for the future of Europe, but I don't think that really happened in a concerted way.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka. So to wrap this session up, I would like to thank above all Agnieszka, who was a wonderful speaker, all the panelists for their exceptionally good and insightful comments, everyone from the Facebook audience who has asked any questions or sent them via email, who's followed the session, and I hope you enjoyed it. And above all, I'd like to thank Roger Casali and Elena from New Europeans for organizing this excellent series of reflections on the future of Europe. With this, I would like to remind you that our next session or next talk will be on the 26th of April with the presentation by Roxana Barbulescu, who's also participated in tonight's panel. You can find all the details at neweuropeans.net. So thank you very much for following us tonight and have a good evening.